Oh, hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. My name is Fiona O'Connor, and I work on the Toronto Public Library's innovation team. I will be your moderator for tonight's program. So I'd like to begin with the library's land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that the Toronto Public Library is situated on Indigenous land and dish with one spoon territory. This is a traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Toronto Public Library gratefully acknowledges these Indigenous nations for their guardianship of this land. So I'd like to begin with an overview of how to navigate the platform that we are on. So to the right of the screen is where you will chat. If you have a question, please enter it in the question tab at the bottom of the screen. And at the end of the presentation, Marley will answer your questions. And also during the presentation, you'll have the option to answer a couple of fun polls questions. You will access the poll at the bottom of the screen. So I did include a few links in the chat about our online and social media policy statement and rules of conduct. So please do check that out. And thank you for joining us tonight for a talk on digital illustration presented from a former Toronto Public Library innovator in resident, Marley Allen-Ash. This talk will be a brief look into what illustration is, the varied applications for digital illustrated work, and the different tools digital illustrators use in their practices. So I'm excited to introduce our presenter tonight. So Marley Allen-Ash is an illustrator working and living in Toronto, Canada. She enjoys the interplay of bright colors, texture, and movement, and incorporates both digital tools and traditional media into her process. So she's worked with a variety of clients, including the Globe and Mail, Reader's Digest, CANADALAND, Choosing Wisely Canada, and UHNOpenlab. Outside of her illustration practice, she also works on murals and collaborates with her collaborative Grab Bag Club. So she's graduated from OCAD University with a Bachelor of Design, and her work has been recognized by American Illustration, 3x3 magazine, and Creative Quarterly. So please welcome Marley, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. I'm really excited to talk about illustration today. I'm just going to bring up my little keynote. So hopefully that worked. Close message. There we go. Yeah, so Fiona gave me a very kind introduction there. I'm a freelance illustrator. I've been working for about 5 years. I work primarily digitally, so I'm going to be talking a bit about digital illustration today, kind of what is illustration, what tools do digital illustrators use, kind of how do they work, what you can use illustration for. So just show you some examples of my work. If I can get going here. So as I said before, I work mostly in Photoshop, mostly digitally. I do bring in some textures that I've made using like traditional media like paint and watercolor, but most of my stuff is assembled in Photoshop. Can I get the thing to move? So yeah, here's another example of my work. I do a lot of stuff for editorial fields, so that like magazines and newspapers and stuff like that. And then I also do a lot of public health campaign work. And in addition to making these kind of static illustrations, I also make stuff that moves. I work on a lot of animated illustration. So this is an example of some animated work I've done that I did for The Local, which is kind of a local Toronto online publication that talks about different neighborhoods and healthcare and stuff like that. And then, as Fiona mentioned, I work with my collective grab bag, and then we do comic books. I feel like there's a lot of kind of interrelation between comics and illustration, and so I do a lot of both. I do a lot of zine fairs, a lot of going to kind of comic conventions and stuff like that. Yeah, so like Fiona mentioned, I've got a couple polls to do. The first poll, I think, is up now if I understand how to use it correctly. I'm just curious if anyone in this talk has ever kind of created a drawing before digitally. Love if you guys would answer the poll because it makes me feel like there's people here with me, not just me talking to the void. Hopefully I can see the results here. 4 yeses, 1 no so far. So quite a few of you have drawn stuff digitally. So hopefully this isn't too much of a repeat for you. Hopefully I can say some interesting stuff that helps you out. First thing I kind of want to talk about, also, sorry, if you guys have any questions throughout the whole thing, please feel free to drop them in the chat at any time. I'm going to try and keep an eye out for them, and also Fiona's looking for them, so if there's stuff that I miss, I'm going to answer at the end. Please feel free to interrupt me. I guess you're not like actually interrupting me, but chat interrupting me at any time. Let's close that poll. So here's my poll question. I guess first thing to talk about is kind of what illustration is. I feel like for me when I was in school, and for a lot of people, I feel like there's kind of confusion about the lines between drawing and illustration, art and illustration, kind of like what separates these things. Obviously there's kind of a lot of overlap and interplay, but I feel like it's kind of helpful to come up with a definition for what illustration is and what separates it. Gotta keep this open. Move to the next one. This is a quote that I pulled from Jillian Tamaki. If you're not familiar with Jillian Tamaki, she's an illustrator from Toronto. She does a lot of beautiful illustration work and also illustrates books, editorial illustrations, a lot of great comics. She also used to teach in New York at Parsons. And she kept this blog that was a lot about kind of info that she wished students knew and wished people knew when they got into the illustration as a field. So this is a quote from her blog that she kept. So illustration is about fitting your conceptual and artistic style to a problem. There's a solving aspect to it. The joy of illustration is striking the delicate balance of solving the problem with artistry. So basically, I think of illustration as this act of problem solving. You kind of use the tool of drawing, and today we're going to talk about drawing digitally mainly, to solve this problem. The problem can be a news article that you need to put an illustration beside, a magazine story, a book that you're trying to make the book cover for, like a magic card description that you're trying to put an illustration with. All these things, someone is going to approach you with this problem, and then you're going to use illustration, you're going to use drawing to come up with the solution that communicates something. Yeah, so here's my little drawing that. In this one, you're given an article, and then you're coming up with something that communicates something about the article or draws people into the article, or just is like visually interesting to act as an accompaniment with it. Another example would be someone giving you the manuscript for Harry Potter and you're coming up with the cover for it. You're taking that problem, which is a book that you need to draw people into, make look interesting, provide kind of draw through marketing, and then you're going to make a bunch of visual choices in terms of subject matter and color and composition and layout to make a visual solution, which is the cover for that Harry Potter book. So I have a couple examples of my own work, just that problem solving, taking problem from a client and making a solution for it. This is a article that I recently illustrated for the New York Times last month. It was a really straightforward article. You can see from the title that I stole from the website here, how to hand wash your clothes. Clothes, even if your local laundromat is open, you may choose to do laundry at home to avoid exposure to COVID-19. So it's really just sometimes you're doing the most straightforward illustration to accompany some sort of problem. This article, it was just like a step-by-step article on how to hand wash your clothes, from like filling the sink to putting clothing in to adding soap to wringing it out and hanging it up. So they wanted something just really light. They wanted something with motion to kind of draw people into an article that's a little bit dry. So my job as an illustrator, and an illustrator who works digitally, is to make these choices and come up with final. So this is the animated illustration that went along with this article. You can see that it's pretty straightforward. It's literally someone washing clothes. And I stuck with these kind of bright colors, kind of some fun textures, hopefully kind of adding some interest, and then also keeping it light to go along with this article. Got another example, just so you can think a little more about problem solution kind of idea. This is another article that I did an illustration for. I did this one in the winter. It's for Local Love, which is this website that is associated with United Way. They do stories about Toronto. They did this, ran this story called What People Just Don't Get About Homeless Youth in Canada. Street kids are not just rebels without a cause, they want and need your help. So they wanted something that was a little more serious, illustrations to go along with this article that were kind of more metaphorical, a little bit heavier, but not kind of, I guess, negative. They wanted a little bit of a hopeful aspect to it. So as an illustrator, you're looking at this article, seeing what the art director wants, thinking about it, and trying to come up with this solution that hits all those marks. So I created a series of illustrations to go along with it, but this is the kind of the hero image that went at the top of the article. So it's another moving illustration. Oh, thanks, Kim. Appreciate that. So this is the illustration that I ended up coming up with. We're trying to kind of start out a little sad and then bring some hope to the end of it. It's basically talking about how the community can help homeless youth, how we can work together. And sometimes you're creating an illustration that's less straightforward. You're trying to come up with a metaphor that will communicate the idea of whatever the article is. So in this case, community building. You're trying to make these choices in color and content and composition that are all communicating to the audience. So yeah, that's a little bit kind of more broadly about what illustration is. I'm going to start talking a little more using the terms illustration and drawing kind of interchangeably about kind of the tools that illustrators use, the tools that I use in kind of my process. So what tools do illustrators use? I'm going to focus today kind of on digital illustration. If I don't mention kind of the tools that you use, for the people who have done digital drawing before, I would love to hear kind of what you use to draw, what you like to use, what you don't like to use. But yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about software first. So I create all my illustrations using Adobe Creative Suite, specifically Adobe Photoshop mostly, because I do a lot of drawing and use a lot of textures, and Photoshop really kind of helps you with that. I feel like a lot of illustrators do use Photoshop, but it is kind of inaccessible to a lot of people because it is so expensive, especially now that they've switched to a subscription service. It can be out of reach of a lot of people to pay this fee every month. I still use a version of Photoshop CS6 that I got with graduating university, and I'm really hoping that I can keep using this outdated version and never have to switch to the subscription model. It is a great program for drawing. I'm going to go in, hopefully, if we have time, and show you kind of how I use it to create an image. But there are other options if Creative Suite isn't available to you. When I was doing my Innovator in residence at Fort York, the tech that I worked with, Alex, he really loved Affinity Photo and Affinity Design. Affinity Photo is kind of a equivalent to Adobe Photoshop. It's a really great option. I think it's, do I have the amount here? It's only like $35 and you just pay once. And it's an option if you're trying to get something similar to Photoshop and trying to do that digital drawing. It's a great option to look into. Affinity Design, if you're someone who works more with kind of vector illustration, so kind of stuff like logos, stuff that needs to be printed large. Affinity Design is a great option as well. Clip Studio Paint. I don't really use that software, but I know a lot of comic book artists and a lot of people who do kind of more rendered digital painting. They tend to use Clip Studio Paint. It's an option that's significantly cheaper than Adobe Creative Suite. Works out to being like, I think, like $1 a month. And then there's open source software, which is a great option. GIMP is a equivalent to Photoshop that's open source. I think Toronto Public Library, the Digital Innovation Hub, is running workshops on how to use GIMP if that's something you're interested in. It's constantly updated. Yes, GIMP is great. It's got, I think, basically every feature of Photoshop. When I was in high school learning to draw digitally, it was the software that I used. It's a great option. Inkscape is another open source option. It's kind of the Illustrator equivalent. So again, if you're doing stuff that like logos or design work, it's a great option to check out. The last software I want to mention is Procreate. It's great because it's super inexpensive, but it does require you to have access to an iPad. But if that's something that you have access to, I really recommend checking Procreate out. It's got basically all the features of Photoshop and is significantly cheaper and significantly kind of an easier interface to understand. So I'm also going to talk about kind of drawing options, hardware side. So there's a lot of, you'll be able to use most of those with a Wacom tablet. I believe you can use, so you can use basically all of them with a Wacom tablet. What do I have? Let me look. Except for Procreate because it's iPad only, but yes, you can use Adobe, Affinity, GIMP, Inkscape, all of those, Clip Studio Paint, all with a Wacom tablet. And I think I forgot to mention Blender, but if you're someone who's into kind of like 3D illustration, Blender is a open source 3D software that I would also recommend checking out. So yeah, I use a drawing tablet in order to kind of input drawing digitally. They're great tools. Once the libraries open up again, I know the Digital Innovation Hub allows you to use tablets there if that's something that you want to try out. Wacom tablets are kind of the most well-known brand of them, but they're definitely not the only brand that you can use. I have this Huion tablet that I've had for like 5 years. It's a great equivalent to a Wacom. I'm super happy with it. I've been using it forever, and it's significantly cheaper. You also don't necessarily need to use a tablet to draw digitally. If you're someone who's doing kind of more design-based work, or you're okay with using like the pen tool and kind of making shapes by kind of combining other shapes and stuff like that. That's a bad explanation, but you can use a mouse to draw digitally as well. It's worth trying out. If a tablet isn't something that's available to you, I would recommend trying out using GIMP or something with just a mouse. Also, there's opportunities to draw stuff by hand. A lot of illustrators do black and white work and then import into their computer to work digitally. And colorize stuff. It's a lot easier to color stuff with a mouse if you don't have access to a tablet. These are still options available to you even if you don't have a tablet. Also, if you have a trackpad, you can kind of mimic using a tablet to some degree, drawing digitally. But yeah, I would just suggest if you're looking to get a tablet to check out other brands other than Wacom, because you might be able to find something that's a little more accessibly priced in a Wacom tablet that'll work just as well for you. So I'm also going to talk a bit about what you can do with illustration once you start working with it. If you are an illustrator, I feel like there's a lot of different fields for illustration. I've got a few of them listed here, but there's obviously a lot more that I haven't mentioned. I have a few examples of illustrators that I wanted to share with you guys. I have a bunch of links that I'm going to put into the chat. I don't want to kind of broadcast people's work without their permission, but I think it's really nice if you guys want to take the time to click on the links and kind of take a look at people's work as I go through talking about these different fields. Please feel free to do so. Also, if there's illustrators that all of you really enjoy, I'd love to check them out as well. So feel free to add those into the chat. So I mainly work in editorial illustration. So editorial illustration is artwork that's been created in response to a text. So it can be in response to a newspaper article, kind of like a magazine piece. And that was really the field that was emphasized that I went to school for. And I feel like when people think of illustration, they kind of think of editorial work or I guess picture books, and that's a kind of illustration. It's a big part of illustration, but by no means the only field. I'm going to copy that first group of illustrators. Hopefully this goes through properly. Please feel free to check them out. I think there's some really great examples of editorial work. Richie Pope does some really beautiful digital use of textures, use of color. Molly Fairhurst is a great example of an illustrator who works traditionally and then colors everything digitally. So again, if you're someone who maybe doesn't have access to a tablet and wants to try out working digitally still, maybe take a look at her work, and you can kind of use that as an inspiration on how you can combine traditional and digital. There's Juhee Yoon, does a lot of beautiful printmaking and then brings that stuff in digitally. Dadu Shin, Marnie Grallman, also great work to look at. Another big field for illustration is obviously narrative picture books. So that includes kind of drawing for kids' books, also illustrating book covers, doing stuff like providing illustrations for like a middle grade novel. I also kind of think of graphic novels sliding in here a little. I think the line is sometimes blurred a little bit between comics and illustration, so it's worth mentioning. I have a few examples of some illustrators that I really love who are working in narrative and picture books. Jillian Tanakh, who I mentioned before, has some really beautiful illustration. She works kind of in every field. She's got comic books, she's got kids books, editorial illustration. Really worth checking out. Again, the combination of using traditional media like paint and drawing and that sort of thing, and also using digital media. How do you spell the name of the writing tablet you use? Here, let me type it into the chat for you. Really worth checking out. They have a lot of different tablets. And then, yeah, so Anusha Syed, I believe, is a Toronto-based illustrator and does a lot of concept art as well as a lot of beautiful picture books. Does a lot of kind of digital painting, kind of stuff that looks a little kind of Disney-esque, if that's something that appeals to you. Meg Hunt really knows how to kind of combine texture and drawing, and John Clausen also does a lot of beautiful textural work. Concept art is a field where you're kind of creating visual representations of designs, ideas, and moods for use in film, video games, or animation, or comic books, basically before you get into the final product. I feel like that was it's a huge field. Seems like there's a lot of opportunities for in Toronto if it's something you're interested in. And there's also like a huge variety of styles that are interesting to work in for concept art. I feel like there's kind of a focus on people who do really rendered illustration work, but there's also space for a lot of different ways of drawing. So if that's something you're interested in, I recommend checking out these artists. Do you think the iPad Pro is worth purchasing for digital illustration purposes? Yes, if you are someone who knows already that you're going to be doing a lot of illustration, maybe you're someone who works on a tablet and does illustration already, I would say that the Apple Pencil and the iPad are definitely worthwhile. I can't speak to like iPad Pro versus different varieties of iPad because I've only ever worked with one, but definitely investing in those tools and then using them with Procreate seems like a great option. And I do have many peers who have switched entirely from working on a computer to working on an iPad. So I think it can be worthwhile if that's something that you know that you want to do. Another field that I just wanted to highlight is kind of textiles and pattern design. If you're someone who's really into pattern making, it's something that you can really do easily digitally. There's a lot of tools on, if you have access to Illustrator, it's got a really easy pattern making tool. It's something that I really recommend exploring because working with patterns, it allows you to license work, it allows you to make your own work, make products with your patterns on them, and then kind of you'd be able to sell them yourself, have kind of own the rights to your own work, and allows you to make an income kind of from yourself without having to rely on outside clients to a degree if you want to. Obviously, there's a lot of work involved, but I think it's a interesting path. You can also kind of license your work to different companies, stuff like that. So I have a couple of illustrators who do a lot of textile and pattern design. Phoebe Wall works out of Portland. She has a whole store. She went from just making pattern work to producing objects with those patterns on them, which expanded to a whole physical store. Krista Perry does a lot of beautiful textile work that she licensed out. And then kind of just the last field I wanted to highlight, because it's the one that I am kind of the most interested in, is animated illustration. especially with digital illustration and kind of the movement of a lot of things to being internet-based only, especially right now. I think if you're interested in illustration, getting into animated illustration is definitely a good idea. It's a huge field. There's a lot of opportunities for it. It's the main thing that I get hired for. And also it's a lot of fun. If you're using Procreate, if you're using Photoshop, they have really easy illustration tools. I'm going to talk about some resources at the end if you kind of want to get into animated illustration. I think it's definitely something worth looking into if it interests you at all. So I have two illustrators who work with animated work, Julian Glander and Heidi Burton. Julian does 3D illustrations, so he makes stuff move using Blender. So if that's something that you're interested in, I'd suggest checking him out. And then Heidi does her animating in Photoshop as well. So check both of them out if you're interested in that. I'm just making sure I'm on top of questions. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of more in detail my process when I'm illustrating. I talked about illustrating being the process of taking that problem and coming up with a solution. I kind of left out the most important step in the middle, which is ideation, which is coming up with those ideas, choosing how you're going to make your solution, how you're going to make your illustration. So I think kind of it's interesting to dive into how that process works, for me at least. So I'm just going to go through kind of step by step how I came up with the illustration for this assignment. So this is the brief for illustration that I worked on. The brief is something that when you're working with an art director, generally an editorial illustration, they send you a brief, which is the brief kind of summary of what the article is about. Sometimes it's just the headline and sometimes it's like a real summary. So Intercom is this startup brand. They make kind of like AI software for shopping websites. Like when you go to a shopping website and it like pops up being like, hey, can we help you? They make that sort of software. So they run a blog alongside where they talk about updates in their software. And it can be pretty dry. Just software updates isn't the most exciting subject. So they hire illustrators to make illustrations to go along with those articles to kind of make them more exciting and kind of draw visual interest. So they posted an article about how their video software, their like AI chat video software can bring the humanity back to customer support. So they wanted me to make a fun illustration that was kind of more metaphorical to deal with the subject matter. So when I do my illustration work, I start out working traditionally when I'm doing my thumbnails and kind of thought process work. But once I get to the sketch stage, I'm working all digitally. So I just wanted to show you an example of what I do for sketches. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the stuff before this, the brainstorming and the thumbnailing right at the end. But these are the sketches that I drew digitally for this article. So you can see that I kind of went with kind of more fun ideas. All my sketches are just grayscale. They're pretty messy. I'm just kind of communicating the layout, kind of the value scale that I'm going along with, and like trying to get my concept across. It's by no means a finished drawing. So the one at the top is witches learn magic spells while communicating through crystal ball, ignoring books. So they're supposed to be like talking to this witch instructor through a little crystal ball, talking about how they're like staying connected. Yeah, and the second one is woman talks to someone over video chat, other browser windows hidden behind. So they're kind of in some sort of like futuristic scene, talking to someone like a help agent, but kind of in a like supposed to be like a space like sci-fi scene. And then the bottom one, which ended up being the one that the art director decided on, is kind of astronaut video chatting with a support scientist back on Earth. It's supposed to be like a little astronaut on a planet using their like hologram video chat tool to talk to a scientist. So yeah, this is kind of the first stage of what I would be showing an art director who I'm working with on an illustration. And then from there, they would look at the stuff, kind of think about which one works best for them. Sometimes they'll have notes for me that they'll send back, and sometimes they'll be like, you didn't hit the mark at all, and I have to do it all again. But usually they choose one of the options, and then I get to move forward to working on the final. Keep an eye on the time. So this was the final illustration for this assignment. So you can see it's the same concept, but a little more nicely drawn, done in color. I'm just going to quickly switch between this presentation and a Photoshop file so you can kind of see the different layers and kind of how I work with creating a final. So hopefully I can do that successfully. Okay, so, well, close that. Okay, there we go. So this is my Adobe Photoshop that I work in for all my illustration stuff. I thought it'd be hopefully a little interesting to just kind of see how I lay out my files, how I work. So this is the whole of Photoshop. You can see I've kind of modded it for how I want it to look, which is one of the great features of Photoshop is you can kind of choose what tools you want to be available. So you can see, I think probably the most interesting part is how I organize my layers. So all the different layers that I draw in to create my illustrations. I start out with pulling in the sketch that the art director chose to use as kind of the basis as a guide for what I'm going to be drawing. So you can see the sketch here. And then the next step that I do is I create a little quick color rough to kind of think about how I want colors to be. I feel like it's a good idea to think about your choice of color if you're going to be working with color before you get to the final, just so you can make sure, like obviously this looks terrible, but you can kind of tell what I want to be important based on contrast and where the colors are. Obviously it changed a little by the end, but I make this to kind of serve as just a start so I know where I'm going with my illustration. So I keep that in the file just to reference back to while I'm working. The same with the sketch. I keep it in there. And then I start the process of working on the final. I generally lay in flat colors. Let's turn off some of these layers. So you can see that I really separate all the elements when I'm drawing. I tend to change my mind a lot, so I like to keep everything very separate. So if I want to, I can delete stuff and move it around, change textures, that sort of thing. So I start by like bringing in really simple flat shapes. as the basis of my illustration. Just pull all those things in, starting really simply. And then I start to add line work on top of that. So I'm not really kind of a digital painter. I'm more of a, yes, a digital drawer. I don't really blend colors, and I don't do any kind of really painterly stuff. I do a lot of flat shapes, and then I use texture at the end to kind of add that variation. So I start adding in all those shapes, and then when I feel good about that, I'll add in line work. I'll try and make sure that what I've got going reads conceptually, and then also kind of like the colors work for me. My use of space seems good. Stuff like that. I use a lot of Photoshop brushes that I've either made or have downloaded from other sources. You can kind of check them out, I guess, if you want to here. There's a lot of great digital brushes that you can use that kind of mimic traditional media. If you're using Photoshop, or if you're using something like Procreate, I think GIMP also has options to modify your brushes to get as close to traditional as possible. And then I bring in textures that I've made. I will make them using like watercolor, or I'll take pictures of stuff that I think has a nice texture to it. And I will save it. And I have this big library of textures on my computer that I manipulate using Photoshop, and then add to my illustrations, because I feel like the variation just kind of adds visual interest and kind of adds depth to my illustrations. Yeah, so that's kind of the process. Obviously, there's a lot more trial and error involved, and bad mark making, and time, but that's kind of how I think about going through making an illustration using Photoshop. And then that's it for this part. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I come up with ideas. So hopefully addressing the question in here about how I deal with creative art block. I feel like I deal with creative art block all the time. It's a constant struggle for me to come up with ideas. I feel like I really sometimes have to just like, I keep doing this, drag it out of me. But I have some processes that I use to come up with ideas that I find helpful for myself, and hopefully maybe it'll be helpful for you. There we go. So I have a second poll. Maybe you can let me know if you've ever made a mind map, because I find that's the most helpful thing for me when I'm making an illustration. Yeah, totally. I'll add it at the end. I'll tell you some places that I get brushes from when I talk about resources. So yeah, let me know if you've ever made a mind map. Yes, everyone's made a mind map, probably in elementary school, maybe. Oh, some people haven't, but we are going to talk about it. So how do I come up with an idea? As I said, it's a lot of the time, it's a big struggle for me. I generally have to, I either have constraints given to me by a client. So it's my job, and I have to come up with an idea, because that's part of working as an illustrator, or I have to create a problem for myself that I need to solve. So I find it really helpful to come up with constraints for myself to start up. If you can find like a theme to start up, or if you look for articles, if you say wanted to do editorial illustration, if you started to look for articles that don't have illustrations to go along with it, it's kind of a muscle that you have to build up, I feel like. So you have to get used to finding that project, finding something, even if it's a fake thing, like making a cover for a book that already exists. You got to get in the habit of coming up with that project that you have to come up with a solution for. It can be something like fan art if you want to. I think you just have to get into the muscle, get the muscle memory of going through the process of making something. You just gotta like force it. And if it turns out bad, you don't have to show anyone if it's a fake project. So that's great. So the process that I use for, this is the process I use for editorial illustration, but I think it can kind of be a little applicable to other things as well. You can use it for kind of twist it and apply it to if you're doing something that's maybe more like a book cover or working on a comic or something like that. I have a series of steps that I use to come up with those ideas. So you can see the steps here. Start with reading, researching, brainstorming, thumbnails, and then sketches. So I start with first step, which is reading, which I guess you could define as something else depending on what the project is. Usually I'm given some sort of article that I'm illustrating alongside, or some sort of reading material, usually, though I guess you could be doing something like a movie or some other project. So you'd want to read or consume whatever you're doing, trying to glean as much information from it as possible. If it's an article that you're reading, that you're going to be illustrating, going through it and finding what pieces stand out the most to you, any sentences or words that you think could be important, stuff like that. So I'll go through and I'll highlight passages, I'll write stuff down, circle things that I can come back to later, stuff like key concepts, things that could be kind of imagery for you, stuff like that, just anything that seems like it could be even mildly important. You want as much stuff to start with as possible. Then from there, I'll take those concepts and kind of do my own research. So I guess if it's something that I don't know that much about, or if it's something that I know a lot about, I'm going to look into the subject matter, try and understand the concepts as best as you can. Sometimes you're kind of limited based on time, but it's great to kind of look up other articles, look at images of stuff. Google image search is your best friend if you can look at things from multiple angles and just kind of understand what you're looking at. Pinterest is a great tool too. It's great if you're kind of not just researching for this project, but researching all the time. I keep folders on my desktop of stuff that seems like it could be of interest visually, stuff like textures, stuff like historical images, shots from movies, stuff that can be interesting, like both conceptually, color-wise, visually, all that stuff. You just want as many resources as possible, basically, so that your brain is full and you have lots of stuff to pull from. I don't really suggest looking at other illustrators as a research tool. Like, definitely keep in touch with other illustrators, look at them for inspiration. But if you're looking at them when you're trying to build your own illustration, you may find that your work starts to look like theirs, and obviously you want to have your own voice. From there, we're going to brainstorming. Brainstorming is the most useful part for me for coming up with an idea. I'm someone who ideas don't come like fully formed into my head. I don't think they do for most people. So really just making myself come up with a lot of bad ideas, a lot of like mediocre thoughts allows it to all kind of coalesce into my head into something that's hopefully useful. So I take whatever subject matter that I'm going to use and I make a little mind map for it. So it just involves with taking your subject matter, writing the center, and then just writing everything you can think of around it so that you have all these topics, all these words. If you're someone who thinks kind of visually, you might want to add little icons or symbols around it. Anything that you think sounds interesting, maybe stuff you don't even think sounds interesting, so that you have more stuff to pull from. And hopefully if you just like force yourself to do this, things will start to stand out to you. I did this one for Romeo and Juliet. I did it really quickly in about a minute, but immediately if I was doing a Romeo and Juliet cover, there's stuff that would be of interest to me, dealing with the themes of like opposites, maybe dealing with that balcony scene, the fact that it's a play, using stage lights, stuff like that. Obviously a little cliche with the star-crossed lovers theme. There's just stuff that'll start to stand out to you, hopefully. If nothing stands out to you, just keep brainstorming, maybe cycle back to your research stage and then try again. But hopefully I feel like once you do this enough, it starts to form things for you. Then I go to thumbnails. So thumbnails, I take things that seem of interest from the brainstorming that I've been doing, and I try to really quickly draw those concepts out. And by really quickly, I mean like take a second and draw something that's totally incredibly tiny. I'm not sure how well you can see because it's really small, but this is like my thumbnailing page from a recent, thank you, illustration that I did for New York Times about weddings. As you can see, like the things I draw are basically impossible to understand, and they're terrible drawings that I drew in about a second, but you really just want to start putting ideas down as quickly as possible. Draw a ton of thumbnails. I like to kind of like set an amount of time that I'm going to work on thumbnails for, and then just try and get as many out as possible, and kind of don't look back on what you're doing. So you just have like a quantity of ideas that you'll hopefully be able to pull from. And then from there, once you get to a point where you have so many thumbnails that you don't know what to do with them, you can go back and look them over and see if anything jumps out to you and see if anything looks good. And pick a couple ideas, usually 3 or 4, that you're going to pull to make sketches. If you get to this point and nothing jumps out at you, you might have to start the process again, but hopefully you've gotten to the point where you've got some things that you can find and that you want to use. So you get to move on to the sketch stage, which is the final stage I'm going to talk about here, where you're going to be taking them and drawing them in more detail. Still not making a final illustration, because at this point you're drawing several options and you don't want to put in the time to create a finished illustration if you don't know what's going to be chosen yet. But you're just drawing illustrations or drawing sketches that are kind of the size they need to be, and making sure that you're communicating what you want to communicate, what you liked about that thumbnail. If there's something about that thumbnail that you think is important conceptually, maybe think about exaggerating it when it comes to the sketch. Think about how it's going to be laid out. And I also like to start thinking about kind of values, so black and white, thinking about contrast to make sure that the sketch communicates what I want it to. So you can see it back here, that I do my sketches in grayscale. They're pretty messy, but I like to show contrast and like to make sure that I'm communicating what's going to be kind of visually important in the illustration. So that's most of my presentation pretty much done with. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some resources. So these are all some of the ones I've mentioned here. So lynda.com, something that you can access if you've got a library card, which I think you can get digitally right now. I used it a lot in university. It's got really great step-by-step how to use software. Definitely recommend it if you get to a point where you can't make software do what you want it to do, or if you never used the software at all. They've got a lot of great intro stuff. Drawn and Drafted is a set of pamphlets made by a art director. They are very helpful if you are looking into kind of stuff like setting up a portfolio website, contacting clients, stuff like contracts. Basically the stuff that's about being an illustrator that isn't how to draw. If you're interested in that sort of thing, I believe that they are downloadable for free. If you just search Drawn and Drafted, they'll come up for you. Maybe I can, there we go. Ask an Art Director is a Tumblr blog that's run by a group of art directors. and they answer also questions about illustration. They've got both editorial, sci-fi, art directors, a lot of different fields. So if you have questions about the different parts of illustrating and how to gain clients and how to set up portfolios, again, it's a great resource. Also just to kind of how to communicate professionally as an illustrator, they're really good for that. Lightbox.com is a fairly new website. They're great for kind of knowing your rights as an illustrator. Also, they talk a lot about kind of resources so you're not getting taken advantage of with your work when you're working with a client. They also talk about rates. I feel like talking about money is something that's really uncomfortable as an illustrator, and they publish rates for different projects so you can make sure that you are kind of charging fairly and that you're not being like taken advantage of by a company. There's their website that I recommend checking out. Cartoonistofcolor.com. It's a big database of cartoonists of color, which I feel like has a lot of overlap with illustrators. So if you are a cartoonist of color or interested in looking at the work of some really great cartoonists, would recommend checking it out. Same with queercartoonists.com, another database for queer cartoonists. Women Who Draw is a big database of female illustrators all around the world, and also non-binary illustrators. Would recommend checking it out. They also have a lot of resources on opportunities for illustrators, not so much right now, but usually. The hashtag Drawing While Black. If you're a Black illustrator, I would recommend checking that hashtag out on Twitter. There's some great resources there, and you can also check out a lot of great illustrators. And then the last one is schoolism.com. They are an online school that offers a lot of great courses about illustrating and art. They are generally, I think, fairly inexpensive, but they're a great resource. Also, I'm going to just quickly look up the brushes that I use. So I use called Kyle brushes, which now come free with Photoshop. So if you have a more recent version of Photoshop, there's something that you can download. The version of Photoshop I have, I don't think you can buy them anymore because they go with, he's been hired by Adobe. But I also use these True Grit texture supply brushes. They're really great. They kind of mimic printmaking. And if you want to add a lot of fun textures to your work, they're a great thing to check out. They also have like a free pack that you can download that has kind of a selection of brushes. So if you haven't used custom brushes before and you want to try it out, it's specifically for Adobe software or Procreate. Just to be clear, if that's something you are interested in, it won't work on GIMP, unfortunately. But I would recommend checking out their free pack. Yeah. You are welcome. And thank you everyone so much for coming out. We still have a few minutes left if anyone has any questions for me, but I really appreciate you all coming to check it out, and I hope it was helpful. Thanks everyone.
That was great, Marley. Amazing resources. I'm sure everyone was really pleased with everything that you had to offer. I really liked, I have to say, loved the Photoshop part of seeing how you kind of put it together. That was really cool. And that book, I mean, that book needs to be archived with all your ideas. It's really cool to sort of see to sort of see like how it kind of all works, right? With the book, and then throwing it together and making something as beautiful as what you're making. I think it's phenomenal. So good work. And I think everybody here tonight probably feels the exact same as I do. I wouldn't mind being talented so that I could make something I can't.
Thank you. I'm sure whatever you would create was also beautiful.
No, it's not. Yeah, does anybody have any questions? So you kind of went through the questions here about
It looks like someone's got a question in the chat here. How was my first experience as an illustrator?
Yeah, good question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess my first experience as an illustrator, right when I got out of school, a couple months later, I started with like emailing all the art directors that I could find, being basically contacting me for a job, or cold contacting them for a job. And the first one who got back to me was this New York publication that did kind of illustrations that went along with like personal stories. It was a good experience, though. Really, I feel like doing illustrations as a student, it's kind of they teach you the way that you're interacting with art directors. You kind of get this kind of fake assignment, and then the teacher acts as your art director and chooses a sketch to move forward from, and then you make a final. And it was the same working with this art director, but I guess I just wasn't prepared for how scared I was going to be of failing. So the scariest part of being an illustrator was like interacting with a real person who has hired me and given me money to draw. And I kind of froze up a little on my first assignment, and I really struggled with coming up with sketches. And I really struggled with kind of getting my concept across properly. But luckily I worked with an art director who was aware that I was kind of doing my first job and worked with me really kindly and kind of directed me a little bit. So it was a good experience, but I feel like you're not prepared, or at least I wasn't prepared for the fear that comes along with being in doing my first assignment. But from there, I feel like it kind of, you get used to it. Sorry, that was kind of rambling. Hopefully it answered your question.
It sounded good to me. Oh, does anybody have any other questions? We were very fortunate to have Marley at Fort York Library last year, and just gave the most amazing programs that we got rave reviews about. It's such a fantastic topic. And once the libraries open back up again and we're able to offer in-class programming, do take advantage, because we do have the Wacom tablets and Mac computers and so on to sort of aid you in your journey. But in the meantime, and I did provide the link, do take advantage of the e-resources that we do offer. So there is lynda.com, which is fabulous for some of the tutorials on there. They're just phenomenal. And also O'Reilly Public Library's former Safari Tech and Business Books online. They just changed names. Has great resources too, and we've written a few blogs in the last couple of months, especially for like online learning and so on. But do look at what we've posted. We do have resources on open source software. So I know Marley mentioned GIMP earlier in the program, but there's also like Inkspace and Scribus, and like there's lots to choose from that's free for you to learn. And then do take advantage then of the e-resources that we offer with your Toronto Public Library card, because then you can learn a whole new software, and you might be extremely pleased. So do check that out. I did provide a link to our feedback form. I really appreciate if you guys could fill that out for us. It really helps us for future programs. This is very new for us, for online programming. So this could help us get even better as we kind of move along here together. And we do have some upcoming programs that will be taking place. Unfortunately, I'm having a problem with my chat tonight, so I kind of have to do this from my phone. But I'm going to provide a link to some programs that we're offering for the next couple of weeks that you might be interested in, like privacy and AI. And here we go. I think I've got it here. Of course, you gotta love technology. And I will say, and thank goodness for my phone. Here we go. And there you go. So there are a few links for some of the programs that are coming up. So we've got Keith Chats next Tuesday. So that's AI, Internet, and Privacy. And then the following Tuesday, we're going to have an AR, VR, and our current reality, and that's going to be from another former innovator and resident. And yeah, so please keep your eyes peeled on what we have to offer. Now, as for GIMP, back to GIMP again, we will be offering more online programs in that software. So if you're interested in taking a live program from one of our DDTs, please do take advantage. He's pretty good. I've learned quite a bit. I thought I knew GIMP, but I've actually learned a lot more from his class. So that kind of brings us to the end of today's program. And I really appreciate everybody who came out today. Thank you so much. And thank you, Marley. That was fabulous. That was so good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks
really
everyone
good.
for coming.
Yeah. It's always good to have Marley back. We enjoyed her last year. We didn't want to let her go. So it was so good that we were able to bring her here today to give this great chat about digital illustration. So thank you. Yeah. So I'm not sure if anybody has any other questions. So we'll give you guys a couple of minutes.
I'll see this one from Todd. Can you show us quickly how to animate a drawing? I can't, but
if anybody could, it probably would be you.
I would say check out I'll type his name in the chat. Charles Wetner has a couple of YouTube videos on how to animate in Photoshop that I found super easy to follow, especially if you're a little more comfortable with Photoshop. And if you aren't, maybe you can use some Lynda kind of learning software to work up to it. But he really quickly describes how to use Photoshop to animate, and I would recommend checking it out. And I think you can find his Twitter and also maybe his YouTube channel. Great resources to look for. Cool.
I love the mind mapping process. I'm like,
yeah,
well, I could do that for most things, right? Not just for art, but for just in general, right?
Yeah, I feel like it's a good way. I did my maps when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do for the classes, so I use it a lot for a lot of different things.
Just to sort of like mapping out your thoughts, really.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm always I've always ask artists, but like, when do you feel most inspired? Like, is there a time of the day that works best for you, or are you like pretty regimental, and you kind of have the same schedule day in, day out?
I'm trying to get better at having like a consistent schedule. I'm not great at it. I am unfortunately motivated by deadlines. So I find if I'm working on a kind of a self-directed project, I have to come up with a big deadline for myself for me to work on it. And I'm motivated by kind of client deadlines as well. So like I do a lot of self-directed kind of comic projects. Like I do them for like TCAF or with my collective. And I tend to, when I decide I'm going to do something, I figure out like when it needs to be done by. And if I don't have a real timeline that I need it to be done by, I'll like, if I want to print it, I'll contact the printer and be like, I'm going to get the files to you by this date. Or I find some way, or I tell a friend that I'm going to be showing them by this date, so that there's like the shame
under the
of
gun.
failing motivating me to do it.
Right.
So that's what I used to motivate myself. Yeah.
That's kind of cool. Yeah, I've talked to a few writers, and they're like, oh my gosh, I only do well at, like, you know, in the middle of the night, and or they have another job and they have no choice but work in the middle of the night. But yeah, so it's always something interesting for me. So yeah, it's kind of like, well, what works, right?
Yeah.
Oh, so that, I think this brings us really to the end today. So it's just we went a little bit over. So thank you for the people who stuck around. And yeah, so to get out of this, just click close, and that brings us to the end. So thank you again, Marley.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll be in touch.
Awesome.
Okay. All right. Goodbye. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you again.
Oh, thank you.